Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Sigarda, Font of Blessings, a Selesnya commander from March of the Machine, The Aftermath. As always, I've designed this deck to cost less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including basic lands at 10 cents a piece. And, as always, the link to the deck list is in the description down below. Now let's get into this deck. So, Sigarda is a 4/4 legendary angel for 2 generic, a green, and a white mana with flying. Additionally, Sigarda gives other permanents we control hexproof, lets us look at the top of our library whenever we wish, and lets us cast human and angel spells off the top of our library. So that's a pretty useful combination of abilities, with some built-in protection and access to more cards to cast, even though it's not directly card draw. Now let's look at the goals of our deck and how we'll build around these abilities. To begin, we'll ensure that the vast majority of our creature spells are humans or angels to get as much out of Sigarda's last ability as we can. Due to general mana costs and tribal interactions, humans make up the bulk of our army, but there's a number of angels with impactful abilities in the higher CMC range of our deck. We'll also make use of a number of anthems and buffing effects to make our entire army stronger, as there are many anthems for humans and creatures in general in Selesnya colors. Also, throughout the game, we're going to be considering our library to be an extension of our hand, since we can cast a large portion of our spells from the top of it. However, we won't always top deck a human or an angel, or we may just see a card on the top of our library, since we can look at any time with Sigarda, that we don't particularly care to draw later. And as such, we'll want to make use of some permanents that will let us either scry or mill ourselves, which will let us refresh the top of our library when we need to. But, with our goals set, let's look into our 99, starting with Mana Acceleration. First up is Mind Stone, tapping for generic, Marble Diamond and Moss Diamond, which tap for white and green respectively, and Arcane Signet, which will tap for any color we need. Then we have 2 human mana dorks with Werebear and Avacyn's Pilgrim, tapping for green and white respectively. Then we have some land-based ramps, starting with Wild Growth, an enchantment that gives you an extra green mana when the land it enchants is tapped for mana. Then we have Font of Fertility, an enchantment that can be sacrificed to let you tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Similarly, we have Rampant Growth, a sorcery that tutors a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And finally, we have Cultivate, which has you search your library for 2 basic lands, which you reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. Alright, now that we've got some ramp, let's look at the permanents that will let us scry or mill so that we can refresh the top of our deck when Sigarda's out. First up is Darksteel Pendant, which is indestructible, and for 1 mana, it can be tapped, and it'll let you scry 1. Note that this was printed just before scry became a keyword. Then we have Crystal Ball, which for 1 mana, it can be tapped to let you scry 2. Witch's Eye, an equipment that grants its creature the ability to scry 1 when tapped with 1 generic mana. And there's Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which has you scry 1 at the beginning of your upkeep. Additionally, you can draw a card if you pay 1 green mana whenever you cast a creature spell. Now let's move on to some milling effects, starting with Codex Shredder, which can be tapped to have a target player mill a card. So this can be used on ourselves to have us refresh the top of our library, or, if we didn't need the effect that turn, we can make an opponent mill. Then there's Wand of Vertebrae, which simply lets us tap to mill ourselves. We also have Milliken, which can be tapped to mill a card, and it gives you a generic mana to work with to boot, though do note it's an artifact creature and thus will suffer from summoning sickness. And finally, we have Ghoulcaller's Bell, which can be tapped to have each player mill 1. So, while you're intentionally clearing the top of your library, you may also be inadvertently milling something important from one of your opponents. Now that we've gone through most of the cards that will let our deck function as intended, let's start looking at our humans and angels, starting with those that don't provide anthems and buffs, as those are in a different chapter. First up, we have Segovian Angel and Angelic Curator, 2 low-drop angels, the former with flying and vigilance, and the latter with flying and protection from artifacts. Then we have Imposing Sovereign, which has creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Note that this is the only stacks piece in this deck, so if you don't like playing stacks, it should be easy to sub out. We'll next have some spells that will provide us with human creature tokens, with Torrens, Fist of the Angels, and Were Militia Captain, and Horn of Gondor. Torrens is a human with training, and whenever you cast a creature spell, make a 1/1 white-green human soldier creature token with training. And as a quick reminder, training means when this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And where Militia starts as a 2/2 human soldier, but if you control 4 or more creatures, it transforms into Westvale Cult Leader, which has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, so most of the time it'll be a 4/4 at this point, and it has you make a 1/1 white-black human cleric at the beginning of your end step. And Horn of Gondor, while not a human itself, and thus unfortunately can't be cast from the top of our library, it makes a 1/1 white human soldier creature token when it enters the battlefield, and for 3 mana, it can be tapped to make X 1/1 human soldier creature tokens, with X being the number of humans you control. Moving on, we have Destiny Spinner, which makes our creature and enchantment spells uncounterable. And as something that can act as a win con, we have Angel of Destiny, with flying and double strike, and it makes it so when creatures you control deal combat damage to an opponent, they instead give you and that opponent that much life instead. And then, if you have at least 15 more life than your starting total, so 55 or more in Commander, each player attacked by Angel and Destiny that turn loses the game. Now, let's move on to the creatures and enchantments we'll be casting to buff our army further. Starting with a few cards that give our army keywords with Suruk and Goreclaw, Archetype of Courage, and Audric, Lunarch Marshal. Suruk and Goreclaw have Trample and give other creatures we control Trample, and additionally, non-token creatures we cast will enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on them, and they gain haste until the end of the turn. Archetype of Courage gives our creatures First Strike, and makes it so our opponent's creatures lose and cannot have or gain First Strike. And Audric shares a wide range of keywords amongst creatures we control at the beginning of our combat for the rest of the turn, provided we already have a creature that has that keyword. While there are a number of fun keywords that can be shared on occasion in this deck, the main thing is that Audric will share Sigarda's Flying, so if the two are on your field, your army will become quite evasive. Then, to start dipping our toes into power and toughness buffs, we can start with Hope Against Hope, Thalia's Lieutenant, and Hamlet Captain. Hope Against Hope is an aura that gives its enchanted creature +1/+1 for each creature you control, and will additionally grant First Strike if you've enchanted a human. Thalia's Lieutenant puts a +1/+1 counter on each other human we control when it enters the battlefield, and then gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control. And Hamlet Captain gives other humans we control +1/+1 for the turn whenever it attacks or blocks. Now moving on to some true anthems, we'll start with Sanctuary Lockdown, Kyler, Sigardian Emissary, and Sigarda, Champion of Light, all of which buff humans specifically. Sanctuary Lockdown simply gives humans we control +1/+1, and additionally can be used to tap down an opponent's creature if necessary. Kyler gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, and then gives other humans +1/+1 for each counter on Kyler. And Sigarda, Champion of Light, has Flying and Trample, along with giving humans we control +1/+1. Additionally, when Champion of Light attacks, if we have at least 3 creatures with different powers, you look at the top 5 cards of your library and can choose to reveal a human creature card, which you then put into your hand, and you put the rest of the cards onto the bottom of your library in a random order. Next up we have Divine Sacrament and Wiltleaf Liege. Divine Sacrament gives all white creatures +1/+1, or +2/+2 if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. And Wiltleaf Liege gives other white creatures +1/+1, and other green creatures +1/+1. Then we have Mirror Entity, a shapeshifter, so technically an angel and human as well, which can be used as a mana sink to give creatures we control all creature types and XX base power and toughness until the end of the turn, where X is the amount of mana you pumped into the ability. Then we have Kong Ming, Sleeping Dragon, and Benelish Marshal, both giving other creatures we control +1/+1. Then Trostani Discordant gives other creatures we control +1/+1, while also creating 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. Maya, Rediguard Protector, also gives other creatures we control +1/+1, and makes a 1/1 white human warrior creature token when a land enters the battlefield under your control. Then, Angel of Invention has Flying, Vigilance, Lifelink, and Fabricate 2, so either giving itself 2 +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield, or making 2 1/1 servo artifact creature tokens, and it also gives other creatures we control +1/+1. And finally we have Thraben Watcher, an angel with Flying and Vigilance that gives other non-token creatures we control +1/+1 and Vigilance. Now, while our commander helps a lot with giving us access to cards to cast, we'll still want to be able to increase our hand size beyond our draw step, so let's look at some of the spells that give us some card advantage. First up is Harmonize, which simply lets you draw 3 cards. Then we have Sixth Sense and Rogue's Gloves, an aura and equipment respectively, that make it so if the creature it's attached to deals combat damage, you can draw a card. Given the angels in our deck have Flying, including our commander, we should have access to some evasive creatures that'll make it much more likely that we'll actually get through with these. Then we have Horn of the Mark, an artifact that lets us look at the top 5 cards of our library whenever we attack with 2 or more creatures. We can choose to reveal a creature card from among those 5 cards, which we put into our hand, and then put the rest onto the bottom of our library in a random order. There's also Firemane Commando, a flying angel soldier that lets us draw whenever we attack with 2 or more creatures. Additionally, if our opponents attack with 2 or more creatures and none of those creatures attack us, they may draw a card, giving some incentive for our opponents to not attack us. Then we have Rumor Gatherer, which I'd debated putting into the Scry chapter, but regardless, it lets you scry the first time another creature enters the battlefield under your control during a turn. The second time a creature enters the battlefield that turn, Rumor Gatherer has you draw, and then any subsequent creature that enters the battlefield that turn will have you scry more. Then we have Laid to Rest, which has you draw whenever a human you control dies, and additionally, if a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you gain 2 life. Then we have Lynor, Autumn Sovereign, which, at the beginning of your combat, you put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you draw a card. Now let's move on to the spells that will either help protect us and our things, or will let us interact with what our opponents are doing. For protection, we can start with Fog, which prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Then we have Bastion Protector, which gives commander creatures we control +2/+2 and indestructible. And it might be good to bring up that our commander gives all other permanents we control hexproof. So when together, Bastion Protector gets hexproof from Sigarda, and Sigarda gets indestructible, making it even more of a pain in the butt for our opponents to deal with our stuff. However, we also have Sheltering Light and Mother of Runes. Sheltering Light's an instant that gives a target creature indestructible until the end of the turn. It also lets us scry one. And Mother of Runes can be tapped to give a target creature we control protection from a color of our choice until the end of the turn. Moving on to interaction spells, we can start with Westfold Rider and Cathar Commando. Humans that can be sacrificed to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, though note that Westfold Rider can only be done at sorcery speed. We also have Naturalize and Return to Nature, instants that let us destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Return to Nature can also be used to exile a target card from a graveyard. Then we have Swords to Plowshares, exiling a target creature and giving its controller life equal to its power. And also Generous Gift, which destroys a target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 green elephant creature token. And finally, we have a couple of board wipes in case things start getting hairy. These are Austere Command and Cleansing Nova. Austere Command has you choose 2 from either destroying all artifacts, destroying all enchantments, destroying all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or destroying all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. And Cleansing Nova has you choose between destroying all creatures or destroying all artifacts and enchantments. And now that we've gone through all of the spells in our deck, let's quickly run through our lands. First up are a few Scry lands, including Crystal Grotto, Zalfir Void, and Temple of Plenty. Then we have a selection of dual lands, starting with Blossoming Sands, which enters the battlefield tapped, but gives you 1 life while doing so. Canopy Vista, which enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Fortified Village, which enters the battlefield tapped unless you reveal a Plains or Forest card from your hand. Selesnya Sanctuary, a bounce land that taps for white and green. And Sungrass Prairie, which can convert 1 generic mana into a white and green mana. We also have Path of Ancestry, which taps for mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and if that mana is spent to cast a creature that shares the type with your commander, you can scry 1. We also have Bonder's Enclave, which for 3 mana can be tapped to draw a card, provided you control a creature with power 4 or greater, of which our commander is a 4/4. And then we have Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Myriad Landscape. The first 2 letting you sack them to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Myriad Landscape can be sacrificed with 2 mana to tutor out 2 basic lands that share the same type onto the battlefield tapped. And finally, we'll fill out the rest of our deck with 12 plains and 10 forests. Now that we've gone through all of the cards in our deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, the deck is currently sitting at just over $44 at the time of recording, including the cost of basics at 10 cents each. Now I'd like to quickly go over a few potential upgrades to consider if you're thinking about adapting this deck. I'll start with Minas Tirith, a legendary land that taps for white and gives you access to some more card draw. Then there's Congregation at Dawn, which lets you search your library for 3 creature cards, which you reveal. Then you shuffle your library and put the cards you found on top in any order. Then there's Angelic Guardian, which gives your attacking creatures indestructible until the end of the turn. And finally, there's Herald of War, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks, and makes angel and human spells cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each +1/+1 counter on Herald of War. Regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or play with this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.